So this one will be called the Homeric reality of baseball history. And so, as you may know from these other videos that we've done, my background, I started when I was 15. I was working at the Smithsonian American History Museum and working in the baseball archives, categorizing and cataloging historical information, most specifically old baseballs. So I'm going to pause this for just a moment. So, as my work and knowledge has progressed, my foundations, I really loved studying the Negro Leagues. I really loved um, kind of just the feeling of uncovering history. I think that was the idea, the architecture, the hidden architecture of baseball history. I think from an early age, I had a big passion around it, especially vintage baseball cards. The sense that there was something kind of mythical and meaningful there. And as time has progressed over the past decade and a half, I've become more of a private historian and philosopher in terms of my work. I went deeply, deeply into science, cosmology, metaphysics, um, biology, the history of the universe and the structure of the universe, um, and what that means for humanity at an existential level. That's my background, a kind of intersection of science, philosophy, and psychology, because I see them all as interconnected phenomena, just extending from the foundations of existence in the universe itself. So I went really deeply into that for the past decade and a half and circled back around to baseball and I really just felt deeply intuitively to allow the unconscious architecture of baseball to emerge through my study, through my archaeology, and through my historical research. And that archaeology has really summed itself in the assembly of artifacts, whether those are uh, artist proofs of early Negro Leagues All-Star Games materials like programs or halftone photographs of early Cuban baseball history in the Bohemia magazine archives. We've gone over a lot of this material. I've kind of used it as visual aids and guides as we've gone through this journey of baseball history and the meaning of culture and mythology and how it functions at an existential level and a metaphysical level for as a guiding course of humanity in terms of meaning in the universe, right? As an extension of meaning in the universe and the creation of it through looking directly at the existential foundations of what it is to be human and how to participate directly in the universal imperatives of creation and play. Um, so, as I built this archive, I noticed unconsciously it's the power of the unconscious historically is so fantastic. It's that all of this work of distilling this information and this knowledge and this historical material, not only in terms of baseball culture over the past 20 years and my work with baseball archaeology and archivism, um, there's that quality, but then also combined with the scientific, larger, deep time, deep space, cosmological perception of what it is to be human, combining those two and just allowing it to emerge organically, this archive as it has emerged, I understand now what was emerging is a sort of Homeric metastructural vision of baseball as a something that emerges from humanity's political and cultural unconsciousness as a necessary form to articulate the conundrums of modernity, the breaking of myth and meaning and being into the 20th century, the confusions that emerged through globalization and industrialization, but furthermore, an articulation of a human, mythic, spiritual epic of consciousness. And I've understood in my research, right, I would say I've specialized to this point for the most part in modern baseball. Um, Specifically, I really did enjoy the Negro Leagues, and then I got deep into the Cuban leagues, the early professional Cuban leagues, and integrating that with my knowledge of early modern industrial America and the dead ball era. Um, I see this larger metastructural unfolding that starts, for me, the starting point of modernity is 1964 in Cuba, with the founding of Cuban baseball and Nemesio Romaguera, and tracing the revolutionary developments that occur in Cuba. It's almost like the Battle of Troy, so to speak, that sparks the Odyssey. That revolutionary unfolding of the liberation of Cuba and the abolition of slavery in Cuba, liberation of Cuba from Spain and the Spanish Empire, into the founding of the modern Cuban nation in 1900, which coincides with and directly correlates with the integration of baseball in Cuba, 50 years before Jackie Robinson in the United States with the Brooklyn Dodgers. I'm tracing a teleology, a narrative spine of the history of modernity in baseball, and in doing so, a myth cycle akin to the Odyssey emerges, and we'll go a little deeper into this. Is that you emerge into 1900, and there is this influx. I have a couple of negative strikes by Northeastern State College Library in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, pieces from the American Heritage Picture Collection of the Cherokee Seminary baseball team in 1901. You're witnessing this early fomentation of a radical integration at a global level of baseball itself, including, as we discussed, the 1908 Havana Winter League team, which featured Rube Foster, Home Run Johnson, and Pete Hill in Cuba. And that's, again, that's a strike from the original negative. It's actually, I believe, a picture that has been taken of what is now a lost artifact. It was already highly damaged when the picture was taken. It was a photograph taken of the original photo. This was a common method of preserving during the period of time that this was taken in the 1940s, of a image for which there could not be recovered an original negative. So that's to the best of the existing archival knowledge, to my understanding, is the last remaining artifact of that photo that exists. So we're talking about an emerging consciousness that's occurring in the political underground of baseball, through Cuba, with Black American baseball players traveling to Cuba and playing there, as well as school teams, which are emerging in coalition in relationship to the very highly political process of the re-education of the Native American people in the United States through baseball. And later on, you see in this archive the emergence of players like Charles Bender and Jack Myers, two prominent Native American baseball players who made a significant impact in the major leagues, including Bender with his Hall of Fame career. So you're watching this kind of political underground emerge. And before I get deep into the dead ball era aspect of the narrative, which I have as 1909 to 1919, you have this kind of one last significant early baseball image in terms of black barnstorming. It's a St. Paul colored Gophers real photo postcard that depicts Bobby Marshall, the very early and boundary breaking black athlete in multiple different disciplines. But it also has, as is common with a lot of these political underground forms of documentation, actual written game narrativization on the back of the postcard, which is being sent to another individual. So then from 1909 to 1919, you're looking at the professional infrastructure of baseball in the major leagues as a segregated institution. And in that place, a very fertile ground for the actual transformation of cultural images through the art of the photograph. There's a lot of depictions here from this period of time that I found and uncovered that are actually highly artistic portraiture modes or action modes that are captured by press agencies as diverse as Spooner and Wells, Paul Thompson, the Bain Syndicate. Very highly artistic. They straddle the realm between artistic depiction and documentation, including a press collage by of Tris Speaker swinging, which actually the typographic structure as well as the paint markings on the actual collage itself, anticipate. This is from 1916. They actually anticipate some of the more radical industrial artistic movements such as Dada and Constructivism, which developed just months, if not years, after this photo was assembled in a press room. There's a very fertile, kind of undiscovered high art movement that is occurring in these press offices through these photography syndicates that are capturing the most important cultural phenomenon in America at this period of time, in this deadball era, which is baseball. And through that documentary need, that cultural need to supply the images of this unfolding myth that is becoming more and more prominent and culturally relevant in American history, you have these syndicated capitalist models that spring up to fulfill this need. And this connects very intimately with industrialization in America and industrial culture in America, and the unrecognized artistic movements, art historical movements of industrial culture in America, which include press photography and include the early modern baseball card in such diverse packaging as ice cream or candy or tobacco. So you're witnessing in real time this entire art historical movement that uses photography, painting, mixed media as a springboard, a revolutionary springboard to create democratic access to images across the nation for the extremely important events of baseball and baseball history, which are unfolding at this time. The 1912 World Series, the 1916 World Series, images of the 1919 World Series, right? These are massive, massive events which impact the American political and cultural public consciousness itself. And the demand for images there is perhaps higher than anywhere else, even perhaps more so than war photography, which is how the photojournalism in America initially gets started in the late 1800s. So you're witnessing a sort of like a mythological consciousness that is emerging in early America through photography as a very, very prominent and necessary form. Hold on, I'm going to pause this. So as I was saying, a very prominent and necessary form, which is obscured. It's actually obscured by the documentary necessity, documentary necessity and industrial necessity of the creation and production of these images. It's not being framed as an art historical movement of individuals or a revolutionary movement. It's being framed as an industrial necessity, which is powering the American cultural machine of the production and creation of images to supplement this mythology. So just to give you the metastructural understanding, you have this very subversive, unique, and profound movement of revolutionary baseball that is occurring beneath the surface of the industrial cultural narrative of baseball proper in terms of the professional league in America, through exclusion, through segregation, that is unfolding not only in Cuba, but is unfolding in the black barnstorming of this period of time from 1900 to 1920, when the Negro Leagues is established. It becomes an industrial footing, which itself begins to excel the major leagues and inevitably speeds toward integration in the next 25 years after the Negro Leagues founding in 1920. So you're looking at that radical subversive underpinning, which is depicted here in the archive, especially through radically subversive materials, including halftones from Bohemia magazine in Cuba, government permission letters. Where else? What am I looking at? And celebratory composites created by photography studios, which actually would, including the studio depicted here with N.E. Maceo, N.E., that composite created there in that Cuban studio, he would later on create some of the very profound studio portraits of the Cuban revolutionaries of that period. So there's a very, very profound revolutionary liberatory framework that is occurring, and the the artifacts that emerge from that framework are also radical and outside of the narrative structure of photojournalism that occurs in the early modern United States, which depicts and captures with a sort of regular institutionalized bent the development and unfolding of the dominant visible narrative, so to speak, of early modern professional baseball. And you see a lot of the revolutionary artifacts are much more so of a subversive mode or of a subversive nature, including I have a great one that is included in this early modern dead ball era that actually breaks up the conventional mode of photography as a way of communicating the image myth structure of baseball, which is a letter from the Kansas City Packers, again a rebellion within the duopoly of the AL-NL in 1914 and 1915 as a part of the Federal League that denotes George Stovall's impending arrival as the first Federal League player to secede from the union of the AL-NL duopoly, so to speak, at that period of time. So there's disruptions that are occurring within this I don't know how to describe it, maybe centralized narrative of baseball, and they're being captured in this archive unconsciously as I'm moving through it and saying, here are moments where there's this radically subversive moment or movement of humanity or inclusion that is disrupting this. It actually becomes a very regular, it's an art historical movement itself, the movement of early photojournalism through the dead ball era of 1909 to 1919, and then into a more sort of conventional structure of the image of history as it unfolds, including the rivalry between the New York Giants and the New York Yankees for the early 1920s seasons, and then the slow centralization of baseball entirely into the city of New York with Brooklyn, New York Giants, and the New York Yankees as a sort of unit of perennial confrontation in these World Series matchups throughout the late 20s into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You have a really profound centralization and consolidation that occurs at the end of the dead ball era, which the hinge point that I really locate in the dead ball era itself is the 1916 World Series, because it's just months before World War I, the United States becomes involved. And then again, obviously, the 1919 World Series championship games. I have one here. It's the Red Sox championship caliber infield posed before the Black Sox World Series. That, to me, is almost secondary to, again, what is more of a political disruption to the narrative structure of baseball in World War I than the movement or moment that occurs in baseball with the 1919 Black Sox shortly thereafter. And the reason that World War I is so specifically disruptive and the last World Series game is so important is that you have these headlines across the nation that are describing the outbreak of World War I almost exclusively. And in the same breath and in the same headline, they're describing the unfolding of the 1916 World Series with the Red Sox and the Brooklyn Robins. It's a very powerful moment of the national consciousness. Almost, it's prioritizing in real time the culture of baseball, perhaps above all else, which is a really, really powerful, striking kind of encounter that I'm perceiving here in terms of the globalization movement that is occurring worldwide through industrialization and through the propagation of images and the ability to travel, the ability to move, and how that impacts the national consciousness and how baseball continues to grow even in the midst of this conflict and become more and more of a priority in the national consciousness. So as we get towards the end of the dead ball era, there is this dynastic conflict between the small ball New York Giants of John McGraw's managerial territory and the emerging power threat of the New York Yankees. And that's highly documented here, as well as the slow death of the dead ball mentality, because the way that the game is being played is changing. But you still see progressively um, this subversive element which acts as a counter specifically through Cuba. I think Cuba in particular continues to be the focus because it is the integrative professional baseball force that still exists and is existing during this period of time, even perhaps more so than the Negro Leagues as a professional institution which does take in Cuban players, such as Jose Mendez with the Kansas City Monarchs, but the Cuban League itself continues to act as that first foothold of the integrative power of baseball, and actually includes a lot of professional baseball players from the institutionalized league in the United States who come to Cuba to play in the winter leagues. So there's a total integration that occurs there across the entire spectrum of the different forms of baseball that are being developed and unfolding beneath the dominant narrative of American professional segregated baseball in the early 1900s. Um, and so it's very powerful to see that continue to unfold throughout the 20s and 30s, but also more so to see the quality of the photography and the image work become increasingly cinematic as the shutter speeds, the actual technology of the camera itself evolves on a day-to-day basis in terms of the work and act of photojournalism and capturing these images, because really kind of beneath the story of baseball itself as it unfolds is a narrative of integration and inclusion across national borders and racial borders and ethnic borders. What really more so what you're encountering foundationally is a revolution of image technology, which the medium itself actually forms the aperture of the myth in the way that the myth is being disclosed as a cinematic epic movement from the documentary limitations or the central figuralizations that occurred in the early 1900s. Because in the early 1900s, due to limitations of shutter speed, a lot of what you're observing are more so figural depictions that closely actually resemble painting in terms of how they're being framed and centralized around an individual in this early photojournalistic mode through these syndicates of photographers. And then into the 1920s and 30s, you're actually witnessing the emergence of industrial units that are capturing these photos, such as the International News or Underwood and Underwood. The syndications become more institutionalized, and the figural mode of depiction in terms of individuals becomes progressively more cinematic and inclusive of a larger scope and scale or spectrum of information. So beneath the institutional narrative, which you might consider to be the capital city of baseball, so to speak, which would be the American Segregated Professional League, you're witnessing this unfolding of a technological revolution, which is actually informing the way that baseball is perceived, not just on a practical level, but on a narrative scale in terms of the inclusion beyond figuration into a full spectrum realization of the practice of baseball as an ecosystem. So you're watching a technological revolution and evolution, which includes in terms of broadening the spectrum and scale of knowledge and information. So a lot of what I observed actually through this process of cataloging early modern baseball is that not only this subversive movement that it's actually founded in Cuban baseball through its integration process in 1900 and thus founded in the foundation of the creation of Cuban baseball itself in 1864 and the entire revolutionary political movement that occurs in the span of those 35 years, you're also witnessing this the death of the image and the birth of the moving image, which itself, I think, in many ways ends the mythic era of baseball, because the way that the story is being told includes to the point of which it becomes history and no longer becomes mythology. And the reason for that is that mythology is is in some way abstracted from the literal process and movement and unfolding of history. It in some way is fictional, or in some way is imaginal. And the reason it is as such is that the entirety of it cannot yet be captured or cataloged or understood. So some of that world or that realm of processing remains in the abstract, or the realm of the dream, or the realm of the creativity or the artistry of imagination and thought. So this in many ways is like how world civilizations function. They live in the mythic realm because they do not yet fully understand, so that the mythic process, or the belief process, or the imaginal process in one aspect or another supplants the the total understanding, or it fills in the gaps where knowledge is not yet fully present. And this is the process that we actually observe going on in and through baseball as a media culture. It's a culture of image depiction and propagation, which allows for understanding, which allows for information to be transmitted. It's a highly visual phenomenon. It's a spectator phenomenon, just from the theater of the stadium itself into the way that news media replicates and propagates information to create a national understanding of baseball itself as a structure and as a working ground where information is portrayed. The bat makes contact with the ball, runs are scored, and that is being documented both textually in terms of statistics and qualitative information, as well as visually, primarily through press photography and the creation and propagation of baseball cards through consumer goods. So you're witnessing this epic conjuring of an entire sort of bewitchment of cultural and social craft through media images, which itself is a meta myth. It's a meta structural mythology, which is disrupted from below by the subversive revolutionary crafts of baseball, such as black barnstorming, the Cuban professional leagues, and the Negro leagues, as a radical movement toward integration culturally, socially, and politically, while at the same time, the technology which is propagating the myth center of baseball itself, the image making, creation, and cataloging process of the industrial machine of news media, is being disrupted by technological revolution into the creation of the camera which captures moving images. So you can see even the quality and the texture of these images change, even though the game that's being depicted remains the same and the characters change. Maybe the qualities of the movement shift slightly as baseball innovates itself in terms of technique. But you witness, barreling into the 30s and 40s, this emphasis and movement toward the cinematic structure of baseball as a movement, right? Not as a stillness, not as a figuration of individuals, but a movement as in an ecological process of perpetual change. And this is just the technology catching up to the reality, which then avails increasing understanding of cinematic and full spectrum perspectives of what is actually unfolding in real time. And as such, breaks the myth, it breaks the mythology. And you can see as we barrel towards the creation of the video camera, the cinema camera, in terms of a way of capturing baseball for television, which is public broadcast. The game itself actually breaks from its segregated mythic, social, cultural, and political gates and structure and walls of the city. The technology itself, as it innovates into the broadcast of World Series games in the 1950s on television, that itself coincides, perhaps not even coincides, correlates directly with the integration of baseball as a political, social, and cultural phenomenon. And in the creation of this archive, my understanding became, just through the study of these media images and media objects, that the image-based exclusion and inclusion and narrativization, just through the slowness of the technology and the institutional resources required to capture images, played a massive part in the exclusionary foundation and fabric of baseball, which created multiple different counter narratives. And those counter narratives were depicted in radical ways, such as real photo postcards, which were easily producible by individuals, such as halftone printing by Bohemia Magazine, or reprints from the original negatives by Cuban national magazines in the early mid 1900s, as they were recovering the ontology of the creation of baseball in Cuba. Commemorative composites created by revolutionary adjacent photography studios in Cuba. Documentary letters that were captured. And photographs that are very, very hard to trace. They could be archival photographs that were fit into scrapbooks, perhaps taken specifically for the owner of a specific Cuban team, or a studio cabinet photograph that was taken for reasons unknown in Cuba. You're looking at a media documentary realm, which is a sort of industrial empire of information, which propagated and created and propped up the mythic narrative of the shifts of baseball, which itself, occurring on the ground level, is a great arc of fantastic historical change, which I think is well documented at the institutional level in terms of how baseball is understood as a historical innovation, which has significant turning points with the 1919 World Series, the emergence of Babe Ruth as a power hitter, and how the live ball era, with the changes made from the Ray Chapman hit by pitch, changed the game. I think that's very well documented in terms of the historical narrative archive of institutional baseball. But what's not, I think, fully being understood is the relationship between technology, media, and the propagation and creation of images, specifically the revolutionary innovation of photography, which moves us away from illustration and portraiture as conventional Western art historical modes of understanding and capturing reality. That movement into photography, and how photography actually breaks open the terrain of image-based information, which actually informs through representation what is included, who is included, and why, and the foundational grounds of reality. So if you look at this even in terms of the development of AI into 2025 and the creation of photo-like images, it disrupts the ground that was established by the innovation and the technological innovation of photography, which allowed us to, in one way or another, understand thousands of miles away or even across time what was occurring historically through visual information, not just text documentation, which required a lot of filling in the blanks imaginatively in terms of depicting the scene itself as a holistic ecological event. So I was just recently watching the 1955 World Series highlights. One of the big items in here toward the end of the archive, which itself ends in the 1960s with Satchel Paige's final return and his induction into the Hall of Fame. We'll get to that in a second. But I was looking at the 1955 World Series Game 1 poster, which was put up all across New York City as for the preparation for the showdown between the Dodgers and the Yankees once again, and the Dodgers finally win one in this. And so I was watching the 1955 World Series broadcast, and it really struck me just how between eras this early television camera capturing of the event of baseball was. So much of it is so evocative of the deep past, including obviously the black and white, the sounds they use, all of these different aspects that are included in this process. That they're using the foundational grounds of a bygone era. They're using the foundational grounds of a bygone era to do this. And hold on. So they're using the foundational grounds of a bygone era to create this very, very, very new emergence of image technology and media technology into the future at this point. It's incredibly radical turn, which doesn't have historical precedence in terms of the moving image being directly projected into homes in real time, as opposed to cinema, where you would go and watch a moving image product in a theater, which had been pre-produced and pre-scripted and pre-sculpted as a product, as opposed to a real-time documentation of what is occurring. This itself is a leap in time, right? It's a leap in space and a leap in time in terms of what you're able to depict in the space of the image, but also when you're able to depict it, as opposed to historically across this photographic movement. You have at first the photograph itself, which is trimmed to be published directly in the newsprint in the early 1900s, and then the innovation of wire photography toward the 1930s, where images can be projected across wire to different media institutions, then be published the next morning through this process of wire translation of the image. So you can see how this image technology is evolving and developing alongside the industrialization of the world and the industrialization of America in terms of an image technology which is abstract or more difficult to trace in terms of it being a media object, but is still evolving right alongside the planes, the trains, the distribution channels of goods, and the way that knowledge is being transferred and moved around space and time. It's becoming quicker. It's becoming more radically open. And as that radically opening movement of expansion is occurring, you have a massive, massive shift in the cultural and social and political fabrics of humanity in terms of inclusion and exclusion. And those gates necessarily, I think, through this archival work, I see more and more have to be opened, because as the image technology expands and becomes more radically accessible and democratized through innovation, you have more and more ability to see and depict and hear from and understand the experiences of others outside of the institutionalized, industrialized media outlets which formerly exist locally or nationally that propagate dominant narratives. So when you look today in terms of modern history and culture with outlets like TikTok or social media, there's a disruption, which there's conflict, and there's the conservative repression, and then the radical liberation that's occurring within those outlets, because it's a process of how information is controlled, propagated, and made available. And so when you have this kind of radical leap that occurs really right around the integration of baseball with the television camera live broadcasting these events and games, you have this synthesis of sound, which was normally left to radio, and that would be the way that people would ingest these games, and the visual information, which was the photographic stills that these news media outlets would take, such as NEA, and they would translate those into the newsprint, right? They would trim them, or they would airbrush them to prepare them for that newsprint outlet for the following day. You have this condensation of information into a synthetic media technology which condenses and compresses space and time and makes available the present moment, miles and miles and miles away. And eventually, right, with internet streaming, you have the ability to witness those events not just through regional or national news networks, but through internet connection, which can connect you across the globe to witness these events in real time. So that compression and condensation of information itself is the sort of real Homeric journey, which is underpinning and is being detailed through baseball, through which the integration of baseball is almost a natural and necessary outcome by way of the radical opening up of the channels of information, through which even a process like World War II, one of the most famous quotes was the commissioner said, if black men can fight alongside white men in this war, they should be allowed to play baseball. And this was kind of the big siren sound of integration happening post World War II, is that this information and this knowledge is becoming more available. So the systems of belief that previously existed are being demolished by the sheer fact of that nature existing. It's a very powerful transformation. And again, as these channels open up, the really powerful end of this to me is I kind of signal that Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle's home run chase is the final break between photography and streaming televised news media in terms of moving images. And the emphasis there really does change for this last moment in time. It's wire photography in terms of these images are being broadcast around the country immediately. There's such a high demand to see and to hear from this home run chase. And then finally, I have it condensed in these final two images of Satchel Paige's kind of last ride, so to speak, with the Kansas City Athletics in 1965, and then into 1971, where he's inducted into the Hall of Fame. And both of these are wire photographs. I think it's incredibly important because it shows the end of the natural end of these news image photography cycles in terms of they're projected everywhere instantaneously and used the next day around the country. And that is a very powerful phenomenon that occurs there. Okay. Give me 1 second. So you have this transformation that occurs where the movement goes away from art and mythology. It goes away from this imaginative depiction, which is itself a sort of schizophrenic and delusional diagnosis of the culture that exists at the time. It's a culture that is filling in the blanks of its history, of its existence, and of its meaning in a larger global and cosmological sense. And it's doing that just out of a total lack of understanding and a lack of real structure ecologically in terms of the real history of how it's unfolding, when it's unfolding, and what the greater process is behind that. So you can see this artistic impulse that emerges in the photography, and you can see the mythic impulse that emerges culturally through baseball, especially in the larger national sense, to attempt to compensate for the lack of understanding. And you see that myth break at the golden age period, which coincidentally or not is the period at which the art of photography, in terms of the very careful development of these photographs by these syndicates and very, very high polished silver gelatin photos, which themselves are a craft and a form of artisanship, that mode is abolished for the most part in the name of wire photography. It's not to say that it doesn't remain, but wire photographs become the priority in terms of capturing the important cultural moments of baseball, precisely because they are quicker and they're easier to move information. They're easier to transfer and transmit information nationally or even globally. This shift that occurs is a prioritization of speed for information technology in terms of getting information to the point of availability. That shift is itself the fracture or the fragment in baseball history and mythology, as well as culture, that changes forever the aperture of baseball, that changes forever the structure of what is occurring. Hold on. And the reason that it changes that is because the information is breaking the cultural, social, and political paradigms which formerly existed, in and through which the culture and the nation and the people at large were dependent. They were dependent on the paradigms of belief, the paradigms of myth, and the ecosystem of a lack of understanding to prop up their existence and to prop up their cultures. So when that breaks with the speed of information technology, you then have an era where you're confronted with reality. You're confronted with the end of myth and the beginning of truth, the beginning of what really is. And that's what we see with the moving image. And of course, that's disrupted into the early 21st century with artificial intelligence and the creation and production of not only still but moving images, which can easily replicate reality. So you're entering into a new paradigm, which really was last disrupted by the democratization of the moving image, which is television. And that movement of television into baseball coincides directly with its integration. So really, when you're looking at these social, cultural, and political movements, you're looking at them really within the total spectrum and scale of information technology, how information is propagated, how democratized it is, and then as such, how long those narratives can actually stand. Because if that propagation of information is constricted to an institution, if it's constricted to a power system which controls information through capital and controls information through production, you're limited to what you can actually understand and to what you actually believe is real or true. This is just how belief functions with media and the creation and control of media, whether it's text or images. When that is broken through democratization, such as social media, you are dealing with a radically different situation. You're dealing with a situation in which media has been sort of anarchized. It's been mobilized in the hands of individuals. And that's the springboard that you see. I cut this archive off because it's the end of modernity at the point of television and the wire photo, because you have the internationalization of news media and image objects. And at that point, there is the kind of postmodern war over fact and over truth and over belief, because the information is now present. It's just a question of how the information is being narrativized and the truth is being constructed through images and through information. So that's what I got. Thanks.